Today, I wanted to touch on the Steam Deck verified system as it's been bothering me since the release of Dragon Age and a few other titles in recent memory that I wouldn't classify them as playable. Even though they are and do work on the deck, they're not exactly a great experience and leave a lot to be desired. And really, there's a better alternative that everyone should be using, and I want to point you in its direction today. In case you're wondering what I'm talking about, when Valve introduced the Steam Deck, they also introduced a few categories to help label which games would be supported or actually playable on the Steam Deck. And it's a really great concept in principle, and the 4 categories that they implemented were verified, playable, unsupported, and unknown. Verified means that it's specifically verified by Valve to be playable on the Steam Deck and a good experience. Playable means that it definitely runs and operates, but there may be some issues such as needing to zoom in or have keyboard prompts. Unsupported means that it doesn't work on the deck, and unknown just hasn't been checked within the system. So it's a great idea in principle. We've got the 4 categories. We can put games within whatever they need to be within, and if a game is verified, then I could just assume that out of the box it's going to work on my Steam Deck, right? Well, not exactly. For verified games, such as Dragon Age The Veilguard, which I just mentioned previously, but also Boulders Gate 3 and a few other ones that have just recently come out, they are labeled as playable on the Steam Deck. You would expect them to run great and just be an amazing time, but they're not. And for Boulders Gate 3 in particular, the first act is pretty good. The performance isn't the best. You're sitting around 30 FPS, you're going to have dips here and there, but it's definitely playable, I would say, for Act 1. But it's when you go further into the game, Act 2 and Act 3, that's when the Steam Deck just can't keep up and it would become unplayable. And although you could play the game from its entirety, from the beginning to end, and it's a turn-based RPG, so you're not really needing all the frames you could possibly get, once you get to that third act, you're going to be dipping into the 20s and lower on a consistent basis, and it's just not what I would call optimal, or not what I would call playable for that matter. Dragon Age The Veilguard is also playable, but there's some compromises. The experience is very blurry on the deck. I tried to play it and I just couldn't cope with the visuals. The downgrade and the amount of FSR that I need to put on just to get a playable frame rate just wasn't enjoyable personally for me, and I didn't end up enjoying the game anyway, so it wasn't really a big deal. I also recently just made a video on Dragon Ball Sparking Zero, which is labeled as playable under the Steam Deck verified system. And when you do click on the compatibility box, all you see is that some of the in-game text is small and maybe difficult to read, and that it requires some manual configuration of graphics settings to perform well on the Steam Deck. And although this is true and it does perform on the Steam Deck, because the game physics engine is tied to the frame rate, whenever you get dips, the experience just is not great. The game, without the modifications that I made in my previous video, I would say is just not playable or not a good experience and shouldn't be playable within the compatibility. The system isn't all bad, and there's definitely lots of games on there that are perfectly playable and run just fine under the categories that they're put within, but Valve needs a little bit more scrutiny under what can and cannot be there, and we can't just put the latest and greatest and play them on the Steam Deck and expect them to be playable and labeling them as such, which can be misleading for the consumers. So where does that leave us then? Well, there's an alternative that I'd like to point you towards called ProtonDB. It's a really great database that's managed by users, and they provide their updates and statuses for games based on their Linux compatibility, their Steam Deck compatibility, and even now for Chromebooks as well. I'll provide a link in the description, and if you scroll through the most active played games, you'll see that many of them only have a Steam Deck status of playable or unsupported or unknown, and yet they work perfectly on the Steam Deck. And how ProtonDB handles this is that in the right top corner, they'll have how it runs on Linux. So you could have native support, which means it's actually Linux based and just runs without using any compatibility layers like Proton, or it could be gold, platinum, silver, indicating the level of stability that you'll be expecting when playing the game on Linux. Once you click into a game itself, you can filter down by the Steam Deck option, and then you'll see all of the user comments, settings, if they recommend or don't recommend for the deck, and if they made any tweaks along those lines. It's a great resource. I would highly recommend it. If you're looking for any game, this should be your first point of contact rather than using just the verification system. Now I'm going to end you something fun. One game that I just think is absolutely amazing on the deck and just optimized so well and actually only has a playable status is Metal Gear Rising 5. This game runs incredibly well. You can run the game at 5 TDP and have consistent and stable frames at 30 to 40 FPS range. And if you bump up the TDP just a little bit from there, you'll be smooth sailing on 60. And this is just one example of how the verified status can be misleading. There's many that I've provided in the video. And if you can't be bothered even checking ProtonDB, well then the greatest rule of thumb that I can provide you is look at your old back catalog. Look into older games. Many of the titles from just a few years ago run perfectly well on the deck, and you should definitely start there. So that's it for this quick one. I hope you enjoyed. Thank you for watching. Please subscribe if you enjoyed the content, and I'll see you next time.